One freezing night, he saved a little girl from the streets, never knowing she would one day save his life. This is the story of an unbreakable bond, tested by time, danger, and a moment that would change everything. You think you know how it ends? Think again. It was a cold winter evening in the heart of the city, the kind of night where the streetlights barely pushed back the darkness and the wind carried whispers of forgotten dreams. Anthony was on his way home from his late shift, his worn boots clicking against the cracked pavement. The streets were nearly empty except for a few scattered souls, shadows in the night, each carrying their own burdens. As he turned down an alley to take a shortcut, he caught sight of a small figure huddled near a dumpster, shivering under a thin, torn blanket. At first, he thought it was just another pile of discarded clothes, but then he heard it, a faint, stifled sob. He paused, torn between minding his own business and finding out who it was. Something in that fragile sound pulled at him, stronger than the icy wind biting at his skin. Slowly, he stepped closer. Under the dim yellow light, he saw her, a young black girl, no more than 10, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her tiny hands clutching the blanket like it was the only thing she had left. Her eyes darted up at him, filled with fear, ready to run at any sign of danger. Anthony knelt down, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't respond, just tightened the blanket around herself. He glanced at the half-empty soda can and stale bread beside her, realizing she'd probably been surviving like this for days. The city was unforgiving, especially to someone like her, alone, vulnerable, and invisible to most. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just a faint shake of her head. He felt a knot in his chest. Walking away wasn't an option anymore. He knew how the streets could swallow a person whole, strip them of hope, and leave them as just another statistic. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere warm." She hesitated, eyes narrowing, mistrust etched into her face. But when a gust of wind rattled the alley with its icy claws, she shivered violently, and her legs gave a slight tremble as she stood. He extended his hand, not forcing her, just waiting. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she placed her small, cold hand into his. As they walked toward the main street, he could feel the weight of her silence, the unspoken pain she carried. He didn't know her story yet, but he made a silent promise in that moment. Whatever it took, he would not let her be swallowed by these streets. What neither of them knew was that this single night, under the flickering glow of a street lamp, would bind their lives together in ways neither could imagine, and that 20 years later, the roles between savior and saved would completely reverse. Anthony led the girl toward his small apartment on the edge of the neighborhood. The streets buzzed faintly with the sound of distant traffic, neon signs flickering in storefront windows, and the occasional echo of laughter from a nearby bar. She walked a step behind him, her grip still light on his hand, like she was ready to pull away at the first sign of trouble. He glanced back every now and then, noticing how she kept her eyes lowered, her shoulders tense, as if bracing for the world to strike again. When they reached his building, Anthony opened the door slowly, giving her a chance to change her mind. The warm air inside hit them instantly, carrying the faint smell of coffee and old wood. "It's not much," he said softly, "but it's safe." She stepped in hesitantly, scanning the room, a worn couch, a small kitchen, a couple of family photos on the wall. Her gaze lingered on one picture of Anthony with his mother, both smiling in the bright summer sun. He took off his coat and draped it over a chair. "You can sit," he offered. She perched on the very edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap. Anthony moved into the kitchen, pulling out a pot and filling it with water. "You hungry?" he asked. Her head dipped in a small nod. A few minutes later, the smell of chicken soup filled the air. When he placed the steaming bowl in front of her, she hesitated for just a second before picking up the spoon. The first taste seemed to melt some of the tension from her face. She ate quietly, her eyes darting toward him now, and then as if trying to figure him out. After a while, Anthony sat down across from her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She froze for a moment before murmuring, "Danielle." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, like it hadn't been used in days. "That's a beautiful name," he said with a small smile. "Danielle, I don't know what you've been through, but you're safe here tonight. No one's going to hurt you." She looked down at her soup, her lips pressing together like she was holding back words. Later, when she finished eating, Anthony brought her a spare blanket and set up a place for her to sleep on the couch. "If you need anything, just wake me," he told her before retreating to his small bedroom. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. He kept thinking about her, how young she was, how the world had already carved fear into her eyes. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't just a one-night act of kindness. Meanwhile, Danielle lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, the warmth of the blanket seeping into her bones. She still didn't trust him. Not yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but in that small apartment, two strangers had taken the first step toward becoming something more. Neither knew that this night would mark the start of a connection that would be tested in ways neither could predict. The days that followed slowly chipped away at the wall between them. Anthony learned that Danielle had been on the streets for months after losing her mother to illness and being separated from her extended family. The system had failed her, bouncing her from shelter to shelter until she'd slipped through the cracks completely. Every detail she revealed came reluctantly, like each word carried its own weight of pain. Anthony started making small routines for her: breakfast in the morning, walks to the corner store, afternoons at the library. He never pushed too hard, letting trust grow at its own pace. Sometimes they'd sit in silence for hours, him reading a newspaper, her sketching quietly on scraps of paper. Other times she'd ask about his work at the auto shop, and he'd tell her stories about the regular customers, the old man who always complained about prices, the woman who brought in her car every month even when nothing was wrong. One rainy afternoon, Danielle surprised him. "Why'd you help me?" she asked, her voice cutting through the patter of rain on the windows. Anthony looked at her, the question hanging in the air. "Because someone helped me once," he said, simply. He didn't elaborate, but there was a depth in his eyes that told her there was more to the story. As weeks turned into months, Danielle's laughter returned in small bursts. Anthony found himself watching over her like an older brother, making sure she went to school, keeping her safe from the streets that had once threatened to swallow her whole. And when people gave them strange looks, a black girl and a white man walking together, Anthony ignored them. But Danielle noticed. She saw the way some people's eyes narrowed, the way whispers followed them down grocery store aisles. Racism wasn't new to her, but now it came in subtle, cutting ways she hadn't experienced before. One afternoon, after a particularly tense encounter with a store clerk who accused her of pocketing candy she hadn't touched, Danielle came home in tears. Anthony's jaw clenched when he heard the story. "You let me worry about that," he told her. And he did, marching down to the store the next day to make it very clear that no one would treat her that way without consequences. By the time a year had passed, Danielle wasn't just a guest in Anthony's home. She was family. They celebrated her 12th birthday with a cake, candles, and a small gift wrapped in newspaper. She was still guarded in some ways, but the fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet strength. Neither of them could see the future, but the bond they were building would become unshakable. 20 years later, when Anthony's life hung in the balance, that bond would be the reason he survived. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the night air like a gunshot. Maya spun toward the source, instincts kicking in before fear could take hold. Across the street, under the flickering neon sign of a closed convenience store, a shadowy figure was struggling with a masked man. The attacker had one arm wrapped tightly around the man's neck, the other holding a knife that glinted under the weak streetlight. For a split second, Maya's breath caught in her throat. That wasn't just anyone. Even under the dim light, she recognized the familiar outline of broad shoulders, the slow but powerful way he moved despite his age. It was Anthony, the man who had taken her in when she had nothing, the man who had given her back her life. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't think. She ran. The soles of her boots pounded the wet pavement, her mind a blur of urgency and fear. Anthony was fighting back, but he was slower than she remembered, his movements labored. Age had stolen some of the strength she once thought was unshakable. The masked man noticed her closing in and snarled, jerking Anthony toward the alley. Maya's voice tore through the street, sharp and commanding. Let him go. But her words were swallowed by the night. She reached into her bag and gripped the small pepper spray she carried out of habit, her thumb flicking the safety off. She closed the distance in seconds. The attacker shoved Anthony hard against the wall, raising the knife. In that moment, Maya didn't see herself as a woman charging into danger. She saw herself as the 10-year-old girl Anthony had saved all those years ago. Only now the roles were reversed. With a sharp burst, she sprayed the pepper directly into the man's face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes, stumbling backward. Maya grabbed Anthony's arm, pulling him toward her, her voice fierce. Come on. They ran, weaving through the side streets, the attackers' shouts fading behind them. When they finally stopped, Anthony was gasping for breath, leaning heavily on the wall. He looked at her, eyes wide with both shock and pride. You saved my life, he said, his voice rough. But Maya shook her head, tears threatening to spill. No, she whispered. I just paid you back for saving mine. They stood there in the cold night, breaths visible in the air, both knowing that the circle had closed in a way neither could have planned. But Maya also knew this wasn't over. The attacker had seen both their faces, and there was something in his eyes before he fled, something that told her this was personal. The next morning, sunlight spilled through Anthony's kitchen window, but the warmth didn't touch the tension in the room. Maya sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Anthony moved slowly, every step showing the toll of last night's attack. I should have been more careful, Anthony muttered, almost to himself. Maya looked up sharply. No, you've been careful your whole life. This wasn't random. Her voice was steady, but inside, she was still replaying the attacker's eyes in her mind. That wasn't just desperation, it was recognition. Anthony hesitated, his jaw tightening. There's something I never told you. He sat down across from her, his fingers drumming against the table. Back when I was younger, before I met you, I used to speak out against some of the local gangs. I helped put away a man who was running a big operation in this neighborhood. He had a younger brother, mean, dangerous. He swore he'd get revenge one day. Maya's stomach dropped. And you think... I think he found me, Anthony finished grimly. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. But then Maya leaned forward, her expression firm. Then we handle this together. You saved me when I had nothing. You gave me a home, a future, a life. I'm not going to let anyone take that away from you. Anthony studied her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest smile. You've grown into a fighter, he said quietly. Over the next week, they kept low, careful about where they went. Maya made sure Anthony wasn't alone, always watching their surroundings. And then, one evening, while walking home from the market, she saw him, the attacker leaning casually against a lamppost, eyes locked on Anthony. Before he could move, Maya stepped forward, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You picked the wrong people to mess with." She didn't flinch when his expression darkened. Passers-by began to slow, curious. The man glanced around, realizing too many eyes were on him now. With a muttered curse, he turned and walked away into the crowd. Anthony exhaled slowly, relief flooding his features. "Maybe he finally got the message," he said. Maya shook her head, but there was a small smile on her lips. "Doesn't matter. As long as I'm around, no one touches you." And in that moment, Anthony realized the truth. The girl he had once saved from the cold streets had grown into a woman strong enough to stand between him and the darkness. The debt had been repaid, but their bond was something far greater, forged in survival, tested by danger, and unbreakable for life. But tell me, do you believe fate brings people together for a reason? Or was it just pure chance that they crossed paths that night